I'm back. This is part two of the part one sort of Denver high country of the mind, symbol, language, and meaning discussion. And my little guy's off to school, and um, I'm back and I have a couple minutes where I can continue recording for some of this, and hopefully we'll have some material that my esteemed colleague Shasta can pull through and create some content that's a little bit more compelling that tries to get some of these ideas across. Communication, symbol, meaning, right? That's kind of the topic of the show here. But I have uh, I have here the picture of the mathematics poster, which I know I didn't really give it justice um, because it's behind me, but I'm going to share my screen now and you can kind of see it. And as you guys can see, there the map there you have sort of the unity from duality, which is the at some sense a symbol for my metaphysical system, more or less, which is the geometry and the principles that sort of come together in a sort of a unified framework of what's typically in literature called consciousness, which I've called the metaphysics of awareness. Awareness of principles and concepts is kind of where I landed after years of study around some of these things. But when we look at language in general, symbol and meaning as it relates to machine learning, which is my current sort of active area of research, essentially what machine learning teaches us is that if we can translate anything into a symbolic and numeric form, we can then perform matrix algebra against that and be predictive. Ultimately, that's what machine learning tells us. Language is no different than other concepts or ideas. You basically vectorize words and you make them into numerical values, and you build these sort of massive matrices of information, and then you just process and churn through them for predictive and other analytical reasons and purposes, using all sorts of tools that have been developed by that community. And the availability of massive processing and computing power now has made some of those brought some of those capabilities mainstream. Big sort of tech companies, whether it's Google or Amazon or Facebook, that have these sort of massive computing infrastructures at their disposal. Those are the ones that are sort of doing much of the groundbreaking work. And of course, there's search algorithms and the content generation, what's displayed in your feed and stuff, whether it's Twitter, those things are all sort of built off of complex AI algorithms that that anticipate what it is that you're more likely to engage with. And in turn, of course, they introduce the advertising and the other monetization techniques into those frameworks, which are based upon the same principles, all gathering attributes and information about who you are, what your demographics are, and what you like, which of course leads into all sorts of privacy issues, many of which I deal with professionally as a security and privacy, as well as the infrastructure officer at a financial services company. These are very real issues that are of concern to many of the largest companies in the world, many of which are, subject to massive fines, particularly in the EU, if they're not abiding by such regulations. So anyway, I digress, as I like to do. But if you look at this map of mathematics, which I really, really like, actually, I got it and I framed it.
When you talk about cognitive science in general, you can distinguish between.
Sorry, that's the geometry of thinking by a philosopher, a cog science guy named Peter Gardenfors, which is currently an area of research that I'm interested in, which basically constructs these sort of geometrical conceptual spaces of how it is to basically elicit meaning from text, how you sort of translate that, and ultimately you take a piece of text and you're sort of vectorizing it, and you're putting it, whether it's in formal concept analysis or whether it's conceptual spaces, you're basically transforming that information into a geometric structure, right? From which you can deduce certain things, you can do certain analysis, and also transform it, and leads to all sorts of interesting applications. So most of us sort of got to trigonometry and or calculus in school. You can see that there's foundational principles here as it relates to set theory or basic logic, basic theory of computation here from a computer science perspective, Turing machines. It's also an area of interest and study for me. Measurement theory, number theory, prime numbers. You can see these sort of kind of core foundational elements of mathematics, basic rules or Boolean logic. You'll see that I've got something up here which is related to Boolean logic, which looks at certain operators. And this, of course, is foundational to computer science. Also has a relationship between the I Ching, which is a binary-based system based on yin-yang. Again, you come over here, yin-yang. So you can build a whole system of computation and basically take all of language and convert it into basically a system of computation based upon logic and symbols that are foundational and very much related to mathematics. So mathematics and logic aren't necessarily one-to-one correspondence, but there's very close correlations there. And they get into sort of epistemological questions, which is an area of interest of mine too, which is what is knowledge? How is it acquired, right? And what does it mean? And so if you look at mathematics, you have these sort of foundational structures, and then you have fractal geometry, which we talked a little bit about, as it relates to, parenting and sort of consciousness sort of splitting itself. And then you get into some of the applied mathematics, which is an area where I'm spending a lot of time in now, certainly in computer science, probability theory, and where's machine learning? I don't see machine learning here. It's more numerology here. Here's machine learning on the upper right. Those are deep learning neural network models, which look an awful lot like the way the brain is wired. And so there's a lot of literature now in terms of, basic architecture of the mind and neural networks. And I would say a significant area of research, certainly in the philosophical community, in terms of what that relationship is. And you could see and there's calculus that's down here too, theoretical physics. You could see there's just a broad range of, when people say, well, I don't like math, or whatever, there's so many different areas of mathematics, right? And many of which are applied, right? If you look at like basic trigonometry, right? I mean, they use that to build the pyramids, right? I mean, mathematics was invented for its utilitarian purposes, right? I have Euclid elements that's sitting up here on the left, right? In terms of building the structure of geometry and trigonometry, you go to Pythagoras, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. There's mystical elements of that. So you have sort of sacred geometry, you have mathematics, and all sorts of applied mathematics as computing power has now become ubiquitous, more or less, or just cheap. We're seeing really what the boundaries are from a mathematical standpoint, again, as it relates to machine learning. Cosmology as a discipline is based upon, relativity. Excuse me. Also mathematics, Einstein, it comes out of Newton. So all of physics that really has a sort of mathematical foundations. Quantum mechanics has mathematical foundations. But I think where people get confused is the math is symbolic of a representation of physical reality that is modeled, from which we can do calculations and predict, right? So people get lost here a lot. And I say this quite a bit. I borrow from Robert Pirsig, who's one of my favorite authors, along with Ursula Le Guin, whose translation of the first virtue of the Lao Tzu is actually right here that I want to get to too, that I've talked a little bit about before. The map is not the territory. So we hold mathematics in such high esteem. Yes, as it should. It's extraordinarily powerful, right? But from an epistemological standpoint, from a knowledge standpoint, right? From knowledge with the sort of capital K, if you will, it points us to truths. it points us to the very idea that there is an order that underlies the universe, right? This is one of the foundational mystical principles of almost all ancient philosophical systems, right? Is that order was created from chaos, right? If you look at, and I've written quite extensively about this, you can find this on notes from digitalunderground.net. You can also find this in Theology Reconsidered about these sort of core creation or cosmological structures that underpin virtually every advanced civilization in the modern world, even really in the Native American and some of the Aboriginal cultures as well. There's this sort of order from chaos. And you have the logos is the same sort of idea, right? So buried in that sort of deep mystical truth, as it were, sort of emerges mathematics and geometry as sort of a reflection of that. And you can see I've written quite extensively about the Vesica-Piscis, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and its relationship to Jesus and the story of the fisherman. There's some numerological elements to that as well, which are fascinating. I've written about that again extensively in Notes from Digital Underground. Much of this is sort of baked into these sort of ancient mystical traditions. And again, Pythagoras is probably the best example because we knew that he was fascinated by number. Now, the same sort of numerological elements that we see in fractal geometry or the golden pi ratio or the Fibonacci series that we see in nature, right? Spiral galaxies or shells or whatnot, is sorry, I lost my train of thought. But this sort of same structure we see in the cosmos is reflected in sort of mathematics as a generic intellectual discipline, right? And is also buried or implied in, symbols such as this, Sri Yantras, and many of the geometric symbols that are part of the sort of sacred geometrical lore, as it were, right? And so you sort of circle around, you sort of circumambulate, so to speak, this idea that there is a sort of structure to the cosmos and to nature, right, to reality, that in turn we sort of tease out of it using mathematics and sort of physics and sort of these other disciplines, right? And so to that end, we sort of hold mathematics in this sort of high esteem, as it should. It's very powerful, but fundamentally it's a language of communication that is descriptive, right? Mathematics is very specific in many respects in terms of what it describes and the constraints of each symbol and so on. And from those systems, right, emerge the ability to, whether it's physics or quantum mechanics, and the ability to, both predict and also build things, right, that have driven first the Industrial Revolution and then the technology revolution, right, which we're sort of in the middle of. And so I wanted to touch on this a little bit just in terms of the underlying framework as I get into natural language processing in particular. There's going to be the first step of translating that stuff into vectors and numbers. And then once you're there, you can do all sorts of analysis against it, and whether it's formal concept analysis or geometric conceptual spaces. And then from that, you can deduce certain things, right? Once you've translated it into numbers and geometry and vectors ultimately. And then you can kind of see and yield outcomes and understand the data better, which gives you a sense of the meaning that underpins the language, right? But ultimately, and this is, I think, a part that, look, I'm no expert on this from a cognitive science perspective, but certainly from a psychological perspective and a mystical perspective and a computer science perspective, I have certain views that that I've cultivated over the years with respect to how it is that people understand what meaning is. Now, if you've ever lived with a child or you've raised children, you understand how it is that children are trained to understand both language and understand meaning. And when you look at that process, and this again doesn't seem to be talked about very much in the literature, but when you look at that process, what you end up with is it's very much the way that you train computers. And it's called supervised learning. There's supervised learning versus unsupervised learning in terms of machine learning approaches or paradigms, right? And supervised learning is you basically say, hey, look, here's a bunch of data inputs, right? And here's what my expected output is, whether it's, good or bad, or whether you like it or dislike it, or whether you're trying to organize things classify things into certain categories of, scales of, different colors, for example, or whether you're doing digit classification, right, to basically determine whether or not something that's written is, a digit 1 through 10. Or from a linear regression standpoint, you're taking a bunch of sample outputs and then you're looking for sort of a quantitative output, or optimizing a quantitative predictive output, right? So these supervised learning techniques basically say, look, I have a bunch of data inputs and here's our output. And what do you do when you teach a child, right? You have a book. You have a book that has all sorts of fruit in it with colors or whatever. You say, well, that's an apple. That's red. He says red. Apple. You say good. And then you say banana, yellow. It's good, right? Fire truck, right? Yes, good. This is how people learn. It's how we train systems, but it's how people learn. So there's tremendous parallels, obviously, and it's cliche at some extent, and there seems to be sort of a groups of people that sort of want to deny the parallels because it's too oversimplified. And it's not oversimplified. This is exactly the way that people learn, is the way that machines learn. And so there's something to be said with respect to information storage and information theory as a framework within which we can understand the acquisition of knowledge as it relates as a function of information from a human standpoint as well from a machine standpoint. So this is, and you can test certain theoretical components by building them from an engineering standpoint once you've made sort of the heuristic analogies between the two domains or the two systems, right? And that's, again, an area of research that I'm interested in, that I'll probably, if I continue to maintain the myriad of responsibilities I have, I can hopefully continue to do research in that area. So anyway, this is mathematics, and this is a little bit of some of the symbols that I've created, which symbols sort of encode information and meaning. As you look at the development of language, right? The first types of languages were built on symbol. You had symbols of stuff. Like you had a circle with a point in the middle, and that was the sun. It was also the meaning of Ra in the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. And then that developed into sounds, right? Where you would have sun, and it would be spelled S-U-N, and that would be a symbol for the same circle with the point in the center, the sun. Now, a symbol has meaning, and then sound also has meaning, but it implies meaning as it relates to an individual that has an understanding of what the sun means as they've been trained in their particular culture, by their family, by their society. So there's a cultural context to meaning, certainly with sound. And as it relates to language, that's why there's all these different languages in the world. And languages have different contexts for different points of view, and they're not all the same. And so it's a fascinating area, but and one you could probably spend a lifetime studying, but I'm hoping I can at least glean some pieces from it. So with that, before I dive into some of this text that hopefully, Shasta, I am getting to you, this is a translation of the first verse of the Lao Tzu by Ursula Le Guin, who's one of my favorite authors. It's a bit of a transliteration. It's not a rendering, as it were. The way you can go isn't the real way. The name you can say isn't the real name. So right there in the first line of the Lao Tzu, it's saying, you can describe it, but that's not it. As soon as you put something into words, right, you've now missed something. In describing something, you've taken something away, right? Because everything is sort of described in relation to something else. As soon as I voice something, whether it's black, white, blue, yellow, good, bad, I'm carving out the world into a certain domain, and this sort of analytical, linguistic tools for describing things and communicating information is one that's fundamentally binary, which is the I Ching. And I'll bring some symbols of Bagua up here as I get to it. But it's yin and yang. It's a broken and a consistent line. And just from those two elements, you can emerge entire systems of thought and belief, right? From which language emerges, from which certainly all computing emerges, is basically the zeros and ones, on and off. From that, you can build all sorts of systems of information conveying and information storage, right? Heaven and earth begin in the unnamed. Name's the mother of the 10,000 things, right? So you have this initial polarity of heaven and earth, right, which is two of the 8 major symbols in Chinese philosophy. You have heaven and earth, you have wind and a lake, and a man, and I forget that there's 8 of them, and I'm not doing them justice. But this Lao Tzu is related to the I Ching, and they sort of emerge out of, they're all part of the sort of foundational Chinese philosophy. But there's this idea, and this in the beginning was the word, right? It's the same idea, right? It's at first nothing was named, and then there was the word, things were being named, and from the naming becomes the world, right? The myriad of things. It's called the 10,000 things in the Chinese tradition. It's there's a specific Chinese word, but I won't butcher it here. So the unwanting soul sees what's hidden, and the ever-wanting soul sees only what it wants. 2 things, one origin, but different in name, whose identity is mystery, mystery of all mysteries, the door to the hidden. So this idea of sort of the naming and the meaning itself, while can be breadcrumbs, right? There's a certain limitation to that sort of domain of understanding. So if we look at sacred geometry and numerology, and as it relates to the mystical traditions, the very ancient mystical traditions, you can sort of see that buried in these symbols is breadcrumbs to help you understand, the basic structure of certainly the universe and certainly of reality, and to sort of help us through this adventure, one way or the other, to at least understand at some basic level the limitations of meaning and the limitations of thought, but at the same time what it is that we're describing, at least again from a metaphysical standpoint, which is an area of interest for me. So anyway, that's sort of the mathematics. I'll get into a little bit of, actually, well, let me see if I can find, while I have you here, just so that I do some justice to the I Ching symbology, and you can see its relation to the unity from duality. So let's see, Bagua. Yeah, so here's the earlier and later heaven. There's basically 8 foundational principles that emerge out of the yin and the yang. And I write about this extensively on Notes from the Digital Underground. But if you can see, so here's the formulation of the I Ching, right, which Leibniz was very fascinated with from a binary perspective. But from the yin and yang, the Taiji is sort of the universal component. Again, you can see here the center, the circle, the geometrical foundations here, same as the Greek system, yin and yang, male and female. And from these, you get sort of the 4 basic components: the greater yin, the lesser yin. This is the greater yin, this is the lesser yin, this is the greater yang, this is the lesser yang. And then from that, you have the 8 foundational principles that are built upon the 3 elements of the 2. Okay, so there's a whole numerological context here. And I don't really like swamp. That's not really, let's see if I have another one. This is a better rendition of how these sort of things emerge. There's the 8 trigrams that come from these 8 principles. So here we go. This is greater yin, lesser yin, greater yin. And then from these, I was explaining these to my daughter over the weekend, you have these sort of foundational principles that underpin Chinese metaphysics, okay? And from this, the I Ching emerges, which is 64 symbols. Each symbol is a combination of these, of 2 of these, right? So you can have heaven and earth, right? And those are 2 of the 64 symbols, and all these different combinations. You have the trigrams, and you basically read them by casting yarrow stalks, and you sort of construct the symbols. And in that, there's a sense of flow and direction from one symbol to the next. And then with a well-trained priest who's familiar with the system, then can sort of give you a rendering or a reading when you present the I Ching with a given question. That's how the divination process works using the I Ching. But there's an underlying metaphysical structure to it. So you got heaven, lake, fire, thunder, wind, water, mountain, and earth. Those are the foundational principles, and they come together in these different an earlier heaven sequence and a later heaven sequence, which are 2 different sort of dimensional perspectives on fundamental reality as it sits in the Chinese system, more or less. You can see that there's the symbols are just organized differently. And all of this is buried in the I Ching, which is one of the oldest texts in the Chinese philosophical tradition, even really older than the Lao Tzu, and certainly Lao Tzu and Confucius had much access to it. So my system of metaphysics is it's, you know, very much, especially given because of my computer science background, is very Chinese, right? But you, from this polarity, from this duality, can emerge all sorts of, you know, complex systems of understanding and meaning and symbology, right? So that's the Chinese system. I've at least done it some sense of justice there. So to that end, I'm going to read a couple of passages, and then I'm going to close here because I've been talking for a while. But we'll talk a little bit about on symbols and polarity. Yeah, we'll talk a little bit. I'll just do a little bit on symbols, and this, some of this is comes from the text. We've gone back and forth a little bit online to sort of explore some of these topics and these ideas together. We sort of share. She's got a great academic background as it relates to consciousness studies, and mysticism and the tarot, and sort of Jewish mysticism, which is kind of the other. You know, you kind of have Western esotericism and Eastern philosophy. They kind of go hand in hand. They have a lot of the same principles, underlying principles, but certainly the tarot and Jewish mysticism and the tree of life in particular has its own sort of set of symbols and its own kind of mystical tradition wrapped around the Kabbalah and whatnot, which is very deep and very rich and very old. So on symbols in general, which we're talking about, just in terms of symbols and meaning, whether I say Om, right, or God, or whatever that symbol is, metaphysics, right, or whether it's, you know, I call somebody by their name, right, it's a symbol, it's a meaning. You meditate on it, right, its meaning and significance, and it, like anything else that is the focus of meditation, intense longing, will have its secrets revealed. So knock and it shall be open, seek and ye shall find, right? So it's a sort of a mystical truth, but there's a fundamental kind of metaphysical, mechanical structure to the universe that, you know, this mind-matter separation, while it seems like such a strong distinction, right, there is a very close relationship there. And what you will find is, certainly as you know, if you have a very trained and focused mind, just like, you put your mind to something, you'll learn it. Its secrets will be revealed. You know, it will be presented to you in all sorts of different ways. This goes for not just mystical truths, right, or divine or theological truths, but, you know, if you want to go learn a trade, right, if you want to go learn how to, I don't know, make pottery, right, and you think about it, you read about it, you try it, you practice it, you talk to professionals, right, from this, right, a world is opened up to you of how to make pottery. Secrets are revealed. It's no more complicated than that. Seek and ye shall find, right? The same is true of mystical truths. If you ardently pursue them and you pursue them in the right spirit, they will be revealed to you in all sorts of different ways, whether it's the physical reality that reveals it to you, or whether you have dreams or visions or whatever that is, it will be revealed. It's not complicated. Just put in the work and have a sort of a vested, a focused, really pure interest. From there, all sorts of things are possible, right? In terms of knowledge acquisition, in terms of epistemology, right? The study of knowledge acquisition itself, and in terms of gnosis, which is sort of this mystical embodiment of knowledge that I talk about as it relates to Kant and Metaphysics Reconsidered. But it's definitely a way. Symbols, meaning, sacred geometry, numerology are sort of foundational aspects of that sort of gnosis, Gnani type approach. And the system of yoga, particularly as it has been taught by Vivekananda, who was the premier student of Ramakrishna. I'm a student of that tradition. I was trained by one of the Ramakrishna monks. Vivekananda lays out 4 different paths, as it were, to the ultimate truth. One is karma yoga, the path of work. The other is bhakti yoga, the path of love or devotion. The other is Raja Yoga, which is the royal yoga, which is Patanjali's system of yoga, which is, what we classically think of as yoga or Hatha Yoga, which is the control of the physical systems, the chakras and all that. And then Gnana Yoga, which is the yoga of knowledge, reading of the scriptures, right? Meditating on meaning. All of the 4, in fact, are valid ways to approach the divine, and all are valid paths towards liberation, moksha. That's what Vivekananda tells us, right? And it's a sort of encapsulation of Vedanta as a philosophical system, was these 4 pillars. It can be used together. He describes a wonderful image of a bird, and the 2 wings are bhakti and karma. And the Raja Yoga is what sort of propels you forward, and the Gnana Yoga of discrimination is sort of, the rudder that keeps you going in the right direction. And those 4 sort of combine and come together to sort of drive you to source, right? And this is sort of Vivekananda's system in a nutshell. And all of them are designed to thin the ego, right? Such that, and this is a foundational practice of meditation and certainly the Eastern traditions, such that in the space between, you can sort of come to understand that that the distinction between you and your source is not quite as clear as you might think. We'll leave it at that. So there are some thousands of symbols to choose from, of course, and all that come from and ultimately lead back to the same place. Yes, the symbols themselves carry the information, so to speak. The mystery is encoded in them, right? So this is all a lot of what I do in Homo Mysticus, is sort of elicit meaning from these ancient symbols as they're sort of laid out in the ancient texts, which were intended to try and encode as much information as possible in the words and the symbols and the sound. This is why the Vedic rites are meant to be chanted, right? This is the Rig Veda. The original Vedas were chanting symbols. You would have rituals around them, and they would be invocations to various manifestations of the divine, whether it was Shiva or Vishnu, whatever it was, right? Or the sun god, right? Or the soma juice, right? Which was the elixir that opened the doors of wisdom, right? So the sound and the symbol, and they are in fact encoded. This is one of the reasons why I'm so interested in information theory, as you're basically encoding the information in the text and in the symbols themselves. So if you see again from the symbol behind me, right? Everything is there in some sense. There is nothing missing. It sort of leads you back into, and this is why people that have, have studied the mystical tradition have had these symbols revealed to them across a variety of disciplines, across all sorts of time, right? If you look at the symbol of the cross, for example, it's another symbol, right, that has been used in all sorts of different traditions. And so I'll read a couple, another passage here, and then so on subjective versus objective truth, right? So you get this sort of sense of different paradigms through which, different lenses to which you view the world, right? And sort of, people, the psychologists, this is the way to view the world, and the physical, the materialists, like, this is the way. there's a third way. There's a way of higher understanding which integrates and embodies and encapsulates both the subjective and the objective paradigms of thought and understanding. And this is sort of what I get with it at Hira, which is this sort of the interrelationship between the mind and matter, right? Between the subjective and the objective world, because there is an interplay there. And the knowledge acquisition process sort of comes out of this interplay. And sort of gnosis is sort of revealed from this dance between the subject and the object, this dance of us and the world, right? The Leela of the world, so to speak. The Leela of the Lord, as they speak, particularly in the Ramakrishna tradition. So proof is a lower order form of knowledge acquisition in some sense. Higher dimensions cannot be proven in a materialistic objective sense. So, you know, when we look to measure things from a physicalist and materialistic paradigm, there is power to that, right? We can build these massive telescopes, we can drive technology forward, we can transmit information over the speed of light from underneath the ocean between Europe and the United States and in milliseconds, right? It's unbelievable what we can do, given these sort of the foundational principles upon which these sort of physicalist and materialistic paradigms are there, right? But that doesn't mean that the subjective paradigm is not true, right? So you have some sort of Freudian and Jungian sort of perspectives on psychology, whether it's myth and archetypes and their symbols and their meaning, right? Which sort of dovetails into religion and theology and sort of mysticism and sacred geometry, right? That is also true, but you're not going to be able to prove that, right? You're not going to be able to basically reduce those systems of information between, say, okay, well, I have these basic principles, and from that, there are these basic relationships between these principles, and then from that is revealed X, Y, or Z, and therefore, you know, that domain is now of the same weight, right, or of the same credibility as physics, right? Which is sort of Kant's project to a certain extent, was to try and put the domain of philosophy on the same footing as physics, right? And sort of this objective reality metric or measure that we try and hold every domain of knowledge to. Well, it's each domain of knowledge is sort of has its own framework or measure of applicability, right? And so as we look at these sort of mystical or theological or even philosophical domains, they are measured differently. There's an intuitive nature to them, and they are meant and designed to bring you to a better place or a place of higher understanding about not only what our nature of our existence is, but the nature of existence itself at some level, right? Physics isn't going to tell us anything like that. Physics is going to tell us that if I have certain momentum and velocity, right, I'm going to end up over here using a Cartesian coordinate system, right, based upon certain weights and velocity, right, in a certain frame of reference from a relativity standpoint. Well, let's say there's two different domains, right? One is subject to, you know, one set of constraints and measures, and the other is set to others, you know, and they're different. And knowledge, not higher order knowledge, comes from, you know, all of these different domains and how they in turn help you understand not only the world from a practical standpoint, but also from a philosophical standpoint. This is why Aristotle had, you know, where we get the word metaphysics from, to be studied before physics. And it is the principles upon which any sort of physical system, or even a system of chemistry or natural biology, right, rests, because you have to sort of have an understanding of how symbols and meaning itself is sort of organized, from which you can then drill into certain domains once you have that sort of foundational understanding, right? But, you know, once your knowledge domain expands to include the subjective experiences, which is, you know, again, the physicalist and materialistic paradigms really have no way of including that. You know, the whole world opens up. You know, you have now dream, you have paranormal experiences, you have near-death experiences, you have alien abduction experience. There's a massive body of literature out there. You have ESP type, you have remote viewing, which the CIA studied. You have this whole sort of, this is why they call it the paranormal, certainly. I think Dr. Kripal uses that term, quite extensively, and because it's not, you know, normal as it relates to sort of a physical, sort of materialistic kind of linear paradigm. It points to, you look at Dolores Cannon's work, for example, it points to, with hypnosis, a much sort of higher order paradigm that this physical reality sort of emerges from and rests upon. And that, from a metaphysics standpoint, is what really I'm interested in, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that you can objectively prove that God is real, right? So, you know, first of all, what is God? You run into a definitional problem right off the bat. And then, you know, how do you, for something to be objectively true or objectively real, right, you have to be able to measure it. Well, you measure consciousness, right? There's studies and people that are spending time researching this and have made, I don't want to, at some level, I don't want to discount the research, but, you know, how are you going to measure that phenomenon? It's not measurable. Does that mean that it's not true? This is where we run into problems. Domains differ in their epistemological positions. What is the foundation for truth or knowledge in a certain domain? That is a fundamental question, right? When you start to look at truth and what it means for something to be true, you have to have some sort of a framework that says, okay, well, what's knowledge, right? Knowledge is, you know, E equals MC squared. Yeah, that's knowledge, right? I know that this is a table, right? But I also had a dream last night. And it was really quite impactful. And I was, you know, I woke up crying or whatever it was, and it was scary, but I had an emotional experience. Was that not real? From a knowledge standpoint, am I to discount that? It's just a dream. Our entire experience in this reality is subjective. You want to take that and discount that? Well, it's just a mental problem, right? You just got someone who will give you some drugs and you'll be fine, right? That whole paradigm, right, particularly as it relates to the, you know, the Western sort of medicine perspective, is physicalist, right? We're a bunch of chemical processes, and if I can give you a pill and I can change those, well, you're going to get better. Well, yeah, but there's a subjective element to that. And the Chinese system certainly looks at, you know, our relationship to these sort of basic foundational principles, and how is it that we are to behave in harmony with said principles, which is sort of the way and the sort of the Taoist approach, right? The way of virtue, right? The Tao Te Ching. And then in closing, that's probably enough for today. Let me see if there's, yeah, that's probably enough for today. Anyway, I'm off to now work. Namaste. Peace. Hope you enjoyed this rambling, and good luck to you. All right.